Yes, and then it can just save it on your. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Muslim and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, as well as the Khalid and Diana Mirza Distinguished Lecture Series, we are here today to present to you a lecture entitled Kashmir's Historical Legacies. With that being said, our guest speaker here today, who was very thoughtful in joining us to give you guys this very insightful lecture, Dr. Lagori. Dr. Lagori is the Khalid and Diana Mirza postdoctoral associate within the Muslim and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. Dr. Lagori, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this wonderful lecture today. I now invite you to come to the podium.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So here, let me pull this up for you. Just so that you could see it. So we'll be talking about kind of the colonial construction of the categories of Kashmiri and what that actually means within the British South Asian Imperial project. So the kind of point of departure for this is like Edward Said's Orientalism, which brings us in which he discusses this idea of knowledge construction as being very closely tied to the imperial project itself. And in this case, we see this directly, like the authors of these major treatises are directly patronized by imperial authorities. Sometimes they themselves inhabit these positions of authority. And it was in order to make basically managing easier for the British. Now, the difficulty then enters when the British end up using these categories and assigning them, reifying them, essentializing them, and then putting them into policy. So that what might have been like a fluid situation or something that lent itself to multiple interpretations, such as like the interpretation of specific code books and laws, would be now rigidified, stabilized, laid down. And then there were specific individuals associated with the interpretation, charged with the interpretation of these laws so that they could more adequately reflect what would be doctrinaire, Hinduism or doctrinaire kind of Islam, which wouldn't be as respective to the particular localities, circumstances, folkways, traditions, and cultures that you might see across a broad swath of different territories in South Asia. So this is a big area with a lot of people, and they had diverse ways of doing things. When the British came in as a part of a way to kind of make their imperial management policies easier, they sought to order these people, categorize them, and then affix them specific categories within the law books, which were then applied in policies. So the distance between, the knowledge-making processes in the academy and the imperial processes, they were like doors down from each other, in which reports would just be given out. And these reports and these genres had a couple of different registers. One of them that we'll talk about is the register of travelogues, basically. So you had these imperial expeditions where you had these intrepid travelers going to these unknown lands to collect information and give this documentation back to the British. Sometimes this would be in official capacities, and sometimes this would be, well, we can't give you official capacities, just do what you do, but give us the information afterwards. And sometimes this would be entirely independent expeditions. And then we also have like the official gazetteers that were collected and collated by the British. These were something like encyclopedias where there was just a big compendium of all this information about all these different groups of peoples and histories and all of this information about the locality, agricultural practices, what crops grew there, all of these things. The first encounters with Kashmir from the West. So firstly, like the British don't rule over this area. until 1846, and they only do so indirectly. Before that time, we have the period of the Sikh Empire, which ruled from 1819 to 1846. Before then, the Afghans ruled from 1751 to 1819. And before them, the Mughals from 1586 to 1751. And then before that, we actually have indigenous Kashmiris ruling over Kashmir. So it's a series of other people ruling over Kashmir from 1586 onwards. The first Europeans to enter into Kashmir were Jesuit missionaries, Bento de Gois and Jerome Xavier. Later, we get Ippolito Desideri and Manuel Freire, who come in the 18th century. What they're trying to do, though, is to get to Tibet. But on the way to Tibet, they have to go through Kashmir, and they start relaying a bunch of information about Kashmir back to the Imperial, like basically back to the this text. These Jesuit circulars that kind of went around Europe called the edifying letters, the edifying and curious letters of the Jesuit travelers in the 16th and the 17th centuries. First ones really came out in 1605. Then we get a couple of like just adventurers and company people. So somebody attached to the Dutch East India Company, Francisco Pelsaert, was attached to Jahangir's court for a short period of time in the 1620s. And while he was there, he basically wrote this document that's called the Remonstrance. And he details a bit of information about Kashmir to relay this back to just curious Europeans back in Europe in the 17th century. He's also infamous for the Batavia, if you want to look into a famous shipwreck. And then we also have Francois Bernier, who actually comes up with one of the first modernist forms of racial classification, which is going to figure into this presentation in a second. But he actually visited Kashmir. We're not sure Pelsaert actually did. He probably just got a lot of information from the Mughal Empire. Bernier does, and he's attached to, at first, the court of the Prince Darashiko, who is the supposed heir to the throne, who was overthrown in that contest for the kind of imperial succession by Aurangzeb. And then Bernier is attached to Aurangzeb's court after that as a doctor. And then we got our first Englishman who goes in there, George Forster in 1783. So a lot of information had been circulating in Europe about Kashmir by the time we get this work in 1817 called Lalla Rookh. Lalla Rookh is like this genre of Oriental romance. It's a story about a princess from the Mughal court who's going to meet a prince, and she's going to be betrothed to him, and she's nervous and she doesn't exactly know what this, her future life's going to look like. And there's a poet attached to their caravan on this journey. And the poet is charming and he's handsome and brilliant and shares all these wonderful stories. And it turns out that the poet is actually the prince that she's supposed to be betrothed to. So sorry, I ruined that for you. So you're not going to get the joy of it. But Lalla Rookh was set going through Kashmir, and it's written by Thomas More. Interestingly, he never went to Kashmir, and he was relating all these stories about Kashmir as this romantic place of love, which is going to be this enduring trope, specifically in Indian literature in like the 50s and 60s and after, where this is like a site where like you go on vacation and you fall in love and you get away, as this kind of utopian idyllic spot for the enjoyment of other people, basically. But when this circulated in the British kind of imperial ranks, this was immensely popular with officers. So the British government was broken up into three distinct kind of governing offices before they got conglomerated into a governor general that was centralized in Calcutta at first. You had a governor of Madras, a governor of Mumbai, Bombay, and a governor of Calcutta. The governor of Mumbai was an enormous fan of this. John Malcolm was an enormous fan of Thomas More's work, and another major author of a lot of different tracts on India. And a Colonel Mark Wilkes says, well, Thomas More never went to India and he was able to write this. He says, quote, "That shows me that reading over D'Urville is just as good as riding on the back of a camel." So basically, you can know a lot about India without having to go there. We'll get back to the analytical framing in a second. But this travel literature that on top of Lalla Rookh really becomes important for the British in their collection of knowledge about Kashmir, which actually begins with like this unofficial expedition sent out by by the British into Central Asia to investigate the different khanates in Central Asia, Bukhara, Khiva, and if there's any encroaching possibilities of Russian advancement towards Kashmir. And Kashmir then gets highlighted as this geopolitical spot of contest because it's like the closest British point of influence to the Russian sphere of influence during what was known as like the Great Game throughout like the 19th century. So it's this area of increased focus. And then increasingly we get more of these authors who are going there somewhat on their own accord to just travel there and relay this information about Kashmir. So Moorcroft and Trebek was like an unofficial official delegation, and unfortunately they died en route. We also have Victor Jacquemont from France who went there. We have Joseph Wolf, who was originally from Germany, but he kind of became English over through citizenship, and he had a weird kind of personal mission, idiosyncratic mission of just finding lost tribes of Jews in Kashmir. We have Charles von Hugel from Austria, Godfrey Vine, who's a famous cricketer in England. All of them are kind of going to relay all of this information back to the British. This slide didn't come out right, but basically this is going to show you the political maneuverings based on the information that the British have by this time. They're able to engineer a number of crucial defections, which allows them to later lay claim to the area. So the long and short of the Anglo-Sikh War is that the British were able to engineer the defection of the Raja who rose up through the ranks in the Sikh Empire, who was originally from the area of Jammu, which is going to be attached to Kashmir. And they basically said, all right, if you agree not to lend your forces to the Sikhs, should we declare war on them, we'll grant you, a large kingdom and give you recognition. So they sent out this kind of false flag operation against the Sikhs, in which they allowed misinformation to spread that they had invaded Sikh territory when they actually hadn't, so that the Sikhs would cross the line that they had agreed on as their boundary, so that they could then declare war against the Sikhs and were able to amply defeat them, especially without the help of Gulab Singh, who had said he'd stay out of it. So he remained loyal to the British, and the British rewarded him after the war in two major treaties in March of 1846, where they gave him recognition of this gigantic swath of territory that was given the title the Princely State of Jammu and Kashmir. And this became a hereditary monarchical position. So basically, the Dogra dynasty, which was Gulab Singh's dynasty, inherited and ruled over this area for the next 101 years with the backing and the support of the British. So it was a monarchy, and there wasn't a lot of room for democratic advancement or determination. And that's going to be a big part of the problem as we get closer to 1947, specifically in the 1930s, but even as early as like the early part of the 1900s. But again, this is a huge swath of territory that Gulab doesn't entirely control, so he has to send out armies to make sure that he can consolidate some of these regions, specifically the areas that are now part of Pakistan, Gilgit, Panza, Nagar, Panyal, Nasim Daro, some of these other regions. And then we also have this great trigonometrical survey that was undertaken, basically this gigantic, huge endeavor that takes place over 9 years from 1855 to 64 to basically demarcate all of these different regions. And supposedly it went off almost without a hitch in Kashmir due to the cooperation of the Dogra dynasty and Captain Thomas Montgomery's work there. But under this mission, they actually had a lot of these people called pundits who were like secret emissaries who would go into Central Asia, and they would basically collect information they would pose as Buddhist monks, and they'd collect information about different designs that were going on in Central Asia and any kind of potential threats to India. So the creation of pan-Hindu and pan-Muslim identities throughout South Asia. This takes place through a series of conceptualizations, reifications, and essentializations of distinct groups of people. And how do we see these people as essentially different? The British first got to India in just on like New Year's Eve of the year 1600. So the 17th century that they get there. The Portuguese are there from 1498. And the words that are generally in currency describing the Hindus aren't settled yet. Hindu is the term that they're later going to settle on for these people, but they would call them Banyas, which would be a specific caste of Hindus, or Brahmins even, which is another caste of Hindus, or the Gentiles, or a version of that, like the Gentus, which was the Portuguese description. So they started seeing differences between Hindus and Muslims, and they started again trying to categorize these differences. So where do Muslims come from? How do they get to India? This led to kind of a conceptual, conjectural history, which posited that ultimately the Muslims were outsiders. We'll get into some of the specifics of how that comes about. But we get this from throughout the 1700s. Robert Orme writes some stuff about this. Luke Scrafton's writing some stuff about this. Orme is attached to the council at Fort St. George, and he's actually going to send Robert Clive. He's going to be one of the members of the council who sent Clive to Bengal to basically wage war against the Nawab there. And Alexander Dow is going to be attached to the court of Bengal when he's going to be making his translation of Firishta, who's a Persian historian, Persian Indian historian, and his history of Hindustan. So where do these ideas come from? How do they speak to these different people? A lot of this can be traced to William Jones's third anniversary discourse and what's known as the Indo-European proof. Now, this wasn't a terminology that Jones used, but basically it's where he was able to establish that all of these different languages being spoken throughout India, Iran, and Europe were related in some way. And this actually came on the back of a long tradition of looking at the similarities between Persian and the European languages throughout the 17th century. So he sees that there are connections between Sanskrit and Persian, and then Sanskrit and the European languages. So in some way they're connected. This philological project is also tied to developments that are going on in Germany, where there's a school of historians centered at Göttingen, which basically says that we could break up the different types of languages into three main classifications, three main language families. And this is all based upon this idea of the flood and the descendants of Noah's. So the classification that originally kind of emerges was you have the children of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Japheth basically becomes the stand-in, more or less, for the Indo-European language family. Shem basically becomes the stand-in for the Semitic languages, and Ham becomes the stand-in for African language families. And this is going to undergo a lot of disruption, change, but becomes the basic kind of categorical system that's used to classify these different groups of people. But interestingly, they don't only apply to language, they also apply to race. So these were written onto racial classifications. So Hindus were seen as essentially and racially different from Muslims in this categorical schema that ended up emerging. So the idea was that the Semites came from somewhere else, and the Hindus came from somewhere else on the basis of speaking different languages. So like I got a quote up here from Henry Maine: "The new theory of language has undoubtedly produced a new theory of race." What's being discussed in the 18th and 19th century. And it's also kind of contrasted with the development of the identification of a distinct language family, which is not Sanskritic, in the south of India, known as the Dravidian language family, which is tied to this unity of Aborigines hypothesis, which is posited by some of these authors from the 1840s to the 1870s, really. So where do the Kashmiris fit in all of this? So we have these broad conceptual schema, which basically say, all right, you can either be Hindu or Muslim in India. A major work was penned in the 18 teens, completed by 1817 by James Mill. And this became the standard reading for company servants who were going to be trained at the English East India Company College at Haileybury and then be sent over to India. And this was called the History of India. And the History of India basically says there were originally, Indian people that were Hindu, and then over time, a bunch of Muslims came in. So this already posits this identification of the indigenous people of India as being Hindu in orientation, and that Muslims somehow came from outside. So this is written into like Mill's History of India, and it basically became a form of like essentialization over these basic differences which ended up emerging. Now, broader within this racial classificatory system is you had a host of attributes put onto the Hindus and the Muslims. So what the British had basically charged the Muslims with being were fanatical, violent, irrational, uncontrollable. They were dangerous, people. Meanwhile, the Hindus were seen as backward, lazy, intellectual, effeminate, like not fighting people. So you have these essentialized differences which are rooted in these conceptualizations of these essentially different people. So how do the Kashmiris fit in? They're an odd fit. So they have a history which kind of corresponds in this broad imperial ethnology to the rest of India, in that there were people who were identifiably linked in some way to the Hindu traditions, and then the rulers were displaced by people who are Muslims. So then how does that correspond to how they approach and understand Kashmiris themselves? Godfrey Vine is one of the first to lay out this like formula, which gets repeated by author after author. But he says, and even Moorcroft kind of hints at something similar. He says, I was told on good authority that out of 100 Kashmiri words, 25 will be found to be Sanskrit or a Prakrit, which is just a vernacular Indian language, 40 Persian, 15 Hindustan, 10 will be Arabic, some few will also be Tibetan. So then in the 1880s, when Thomas Wade ends up creating a Kashmiri grammar and like these translations into English, it says the last group is Tibetan, Turkey, and others, 10%. But then says that for Kashmiri Hindus, it's Sanskrit and Prakrit that are 35%. So the reason why this is important is that the linguistic kind of percentage corresponds to a racial or an ethnic or a religious percentage. So the Hindus have a more pure Kashmiri speech than the Muslims, because the Muslims borrow more from Arabic and Persian, whereas the Hindus are more closely rooted to Sanskrit. This gets complicated when we get to this different linguistic schema that Kashmiri doesn't neatly fit in. So you see these things kind of repeated over and over. Hinton Knowles, who's another guy who writes out these folk tales, says, oh, well, I got all this information. Who was telling it to you? All classes of people have contributed to this collection. The officiating governor, the poor farmer, the learned Pandit, who's a Hindu, and the ignorant Mussulman. And on one level, that corresponds to probably the actually existing social stratification at the time. You obviously had well-placed Muslims, but by and large, the Muslims were a depressed population under the Dogra monarchy, and Pandits were some of the ones entrusted with higher level positions in the Dogra government. So Grierson was this Irish guy who undertook this 30-year linguistic survey of India. And he basically comes up with this problem in that Kashmiri isn't exactly Sanskrit. And its roots are heavily influenced by Sanskrit, but it's got kind of a different structure to it. And he actually, him together with this other guy, Gottlob Leitner, comes up with this Dardic classification. So within the Indo-Aryan family, you have Indo-European, you have Iranian, and then you have Kashmiri, which doesn't fit into either of these classifications. So what they ended up doing was just forming another category that fit Kashmiri and a number of these different languages in that princely state. So this would be the languages around like Gilgit and Baltistan and Chitral, like Kalasha and Kovar, and a couple of these other languages there, Gilgit. Um, so who are the Kashmiris? Interestingly, for the British Imperial Authority, they're given attributes of Hindus as well. They're seen as cowardly and more akin to Hindus. You see this repeated in Morcarft and Trebek, through Vine, through Bates, through E.F. Knight, through Ellsworth Huntington, and this one guy, Tyndale Biscoe, who established the Church Missionary Society higher education school. It's like a secondary school in Kashmir. And his governing motto for the school was to make Kashmiris into men, basically, because they were seen to be not manly or not militarist in orientation. Under the Dogra monarchy and the Dogra government, they set up an archaeology department, and they then invested a lot of money under Ranbir Singh in protecting sacred sites. Unsurprisingly, a lot of that money, the overwhelming majority of the money, went to protecting specifically Hindu sites that were old, not to Muslim sites. And when they started creating the series of publications called the Kashmir Series of Texts and Studies in 1911, they gave the leadership to a Bengali named Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee. And the early series that came out were all devoted to prominent Hindu philosophers. So these were the Kashmir Shaivites like Vasugupta and Kshamaraj, and also one important author, Lala Det, who's also known as Laleshwari. She's an interesting figure because she rebelled against the Brahminical order in the 14th century, and she's revered by both Hindus and Muslims. But under Mukund Ram Shastri's translation, and also the translation undertaken by Grierson and Barnett, she's portrayed as Hindu. So she rebels against her husband, she rebels against the Brahminical order, and in their characterization, she's representative of the Bhakti movement, which was part of these kind of vernacular movements which had taken root throughout a lot of India in the 14th and 15th century. But they don't make these connections to the Islamic tradition of which she is also a part. Again, she's kind of revered by both Hindus and Muslims, but in this characterization, she's seen as only Hindu. So what ended up taking place? The British saw the Kashmiri Hindus as more authentically Kashmiris, the Kashmiri Muslims as less authentically Kashmiri, and this was actually reflected in the Dogra policy. The Dogra monarchy saw itself as Hindu, and they made a lot of specific accommodations for incorporating kind of this Hindu kind of outlook and this mentality, which was a deviation from the way in which earlier empires had kind of characterized themselves. They may have been Sikh or they may have been Muslim, but they saw themselves as imperial in the sense that they were providing broad support for everybody. Now, the Dogras also kind of portrayed themselves in that ways as the protector of Muslims, but much more explicit about identifying themselves with Hindus, which was also happening against the backdrop of this broader sense of Hindu nationalist movement throughout India in the move for self-determination. So this created basically the conditions for this essentialized dispute between these two different categories of people, Hindus and Muslims, up into the movement of self-determination in the 1930s and the 1940s, and these contending characterizations of who actually the Kashmiris belong to. So when we get to 1947, we have a Hindu monarch and we have a majority Muslim population. Who gets to determine where that country, where that princely state ends up going, whether it be to Pakistan or to India? Pakistani nationalists harped on the fact that the majority of the population were Muslim, so they should be a part of Pakistan. The Dogra monarchy basically held that they were Hindu. Hindu nationalists say that they should be a part of India. And Nehruvians basically said they should be a part of India, not because of any like Hindu origin, even though Nehru himself was a Hindu Kashmiri, but because the Nehruvian project was kind of this multicultural ideal, the secular ideal of India as being a multicultural post-colonial state. So I think I'll end like the formal presentation there, and we can actually go into the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ligori. So we'll go ahead and end the lecture there and hopefully move on into some Q&A and discussion.